It is very common to find yourself on a non-ideal growth curve. If that's the case, pay attention to the next section because we may find the growth curve that best describes where your organization is. I've laid out the original ideal growth curve on the background so you can kind of see where things could be or might have been otherwise. On the left, you still see the startup, the step up, and the scale up, the three different levels, and then the number of years on average that one would find it. So the first one that we're going to talk about would be the startup that never stops being a startup. And the reason that this happens, you see it goes to the startup level, almost transitions to the step up, but then starts to bounce around and never makes it where the board steps up and takes over some of the roles of the founder to move up to the next level. We like to call these a perpetual startup. How because the organization struggles as though it's still a startup, even though it may be a decade old. There generally isn't enough money to hire staff. It's one of the things that tends to hold them back. Board members may not be clear on their roles, and no matter how old this type of organization is, it remains driven by the founder. Maybe a few board members will help. And if you were to ask a board member, they would say something like, we just can't seem to get off the ground. Very firm note of caution here. This is a precarious situation to be in because ideally you transition out of startup in the first 3 years, but if you don't, on average, founders will burn out after 4.5 years if they're unable to fully engage their board. The second non-ideal curve is when the board lacks or fails to manifest critical knowledge and resources that the organization needs to move to the next level. So you can see in this case, it moves out of the startup phase and into the step-up phase where the board member does step up to some degree. However, there may be something that holds it back that hasn't been resolved, some capacity the board doesn't have, or something no one on the board knows. You'll end up hearing them relay this as essentially feels like Groundhog Day. You go to this board meetings and it feels like the same things are covered every time, but nothing ever seems to move forward. There's activity, the organization is doing things, but there are no increases in capacity. So, we might hear something like we're here, but we're stuck. And this describes about 70% of registered nonprofits. The third type of organization on a non-ideal curve is when the board cannot maintain the scale up. So they successfully transitioned out of the startup phase. They made it through the step up phase. The board engaged and distributed the workload, and then they moved into the scale up. But it's often described as herding cats. Hallmarks of this type of organization are that there may be mission creep, which is when the organization starts to try to do things it wasn't created to do, or sometimes chasing grants, looking for money that's kind of outside of the scope of work, outside of the main focus of the organization, even secondary focuses of the organization. You can sometimes tell that there'll be no-shows at board meetings, or sometimes a lot of them, failing to establish a quorum, which is when there's enough board members to take official action. Executive directors might struggle to know what the board wants because the board hasn't stated to itself clearly where it wants to go. And then a manifestation of this is that you'll often see declining revenues and then ultimately the draining of reserves. So they may say something like, the glory days feel behind us, we're drifting, and it feels like we're herding cats. We're now going to review the three non-ideal growth curves that we just covered. In the first case, remember we have the perpetual startup. This is the organization that fails to engage its board and then bounces along, never able to take it to the next level. Again, very risky because there's a high burnout risk for the founder or president of the organization. To cover the next one, we look at organizations where the board did step up, but they may lack the knowledge or resources or be unable to connect with their own knowledge and resources and bring it to the table. And so they find themselves kind of bouncing along in the level 2 step up phase. Finally, we have the organizations that would describe themselves as herding cats and maybe saying something like the best days of the organization were in the past and that they're drifting. And this is a herding cats organization.